Let me start this video by humbly saying, you're welcome. Yes, I sacrificed 2 hours of my life so that you wouldn't have to endure the wretched stench that is the Christian apologetic known as the Case for Christ. Now in movie form. And yes, I did ask the young woman at the box office for one ticket to the 6:30 showing of The Case for Christ. And yes, she smiled. She kind of giggled, actually. I think she may have been playing for our team. As far as Christian films go, this one is in a class by itself. It's well written, well acted, the production values are high, and it doesn't invent some crazy, wacky scenarios or portray atheists as wicked, snidely whiplash-type characters like the God's Not Dead movies. So this really is a huge leap forward for Christian cinema. And I want to be the first to say congratulations on not being so ridiculous. Damning with faint praise, I know, but praise nonetheless, right? For those of you unfamiliar with the story, the movie is a dramatization of the supposedly actual events which led an atheist journalist for the Chicago Tribune, Lee Strobel, to embrace the Christian faith. But the movie, unlike the book, begins with an unforced error. Instead of simply telling the actual story, they begin with an entirely unnecessary embellishment, a fabrication so far as I can tell. In the movie, Lee and Leslie Strobel, the main characters, are out for dinner one night with their young daughter, who chokes on a piece of food and is saved by a nurse in the restaurant who was going to another restaurant when she heard the voice of God and went there instead. As far as I can tell, this event never took place. The nurse character in the movie was in real life a neighbor named Linda, and I'm not even sure if she was a nurse. Additionally, the conversion of Lee's wife, Leslie, took place not because of some such miraculous event, but because of her friendship with her neighbor Linda over time. But this is exactly the kind of thing I saw when I was religious. The simple truth is just never enough. There must always be some more miraculous, spectacular chain of events when you're selling God. My own parents did exactly the same thing when my brother died at the age of 21. He had suffered from epilepsy but had been asymptomatic for years, so while on his mission for the Mormon Church in Texas, he decided one day to take a bath in which he had a seizure and drowned. Of course, that sounds awful. Where is God's hand of protection, and for a missionary no less? So I grew up with this story that God had taken him because he'd basically achieved a necessary level of perfection, which meant he no longer had to stay here on earth with the rest of us. They even told me that he had a choice. I don't know how they knew that, but if you knew my parents, he made a good call. They also told me in hushed, reverent tones that they had never found any water in his lungs. Something I believed until I was old enough to check the death certificate for myself. Aside from the outright fabrication of this choking story, and who knows, maybe something like that happened later on, the bigger problem I have here is the same problem that I have with all of the stories told by the religious in which God rescues or saves someone. Every 5 days, a child in America actually chokes to death. And God apparently sends no nurse or whomever to their restaurant or home or school to save them, which means God saved that child but allowed that other child to die, which makes God a huge dick. Christians, please do yourselves a favor and stop telling the rest of us that you're so wonderful that God saves you, but allows Nancy's husband Sid to be run over by a Mack truck on the 405. It's unbecoming. The rest of the movie is really about telling one very important story. The story of Lee Strobel and his quest to be the most incompetent journalist in the history of journalism. Oh, and to tarnish the reputation of Harvard Law, from which Strobel is a graduate, though you'd never know it. Aside from the incompetent journalism which leads to his embrace of Christianity, there's another story in the movie of Strobel being equally incompetent in another case where, because of his incompetence, an innocent man is locked up and eventually nearly beaten to death in prison. I guess the producers wanted to show that Strobel's incompetence was pervasive and not just related to his one-sided investigation of the resurrection. Well played. If Woodward and Bernstein had been journalists, The way Strobel, as Strobel portrays himself in the book and movie, is a journalist, All the President's Men would have been a short rather than a feature, which simply showed Redford and Hoffman going to the White House, asking President Nixon about the break-in at the Watergate Hotel, and upon his denying any knowledge of the event, saying, "Well, okay then, boy, we were sure headed down the wrong road. Sorry to bother you, Mr. President." Cue music, roll credits, the end. Strobel is equally incompetent when it comes to being an atheist. Although I am the person who's been saying that there's really nothing more to being an atheist than lacking a belief in God or gods. And that's about all Strobel can muster, apparently. But he begins his journey of semi-discovery knowing absolutely nothing about the Bible, biblical criticism, or even how to ask a good follow-up question. If you know anything about atheism, you know that this is atypical. Atheists are consistently, in survey after survey, more knowledgeable about religion than the religious. Nevertheless, the movie documents Strobel going from one Christian apologist to the next saying, "Yeah, but hey, aren't you wrong about this?" "No," they say. To which he responds, "Wow, okay, I guess I was just way off track." In every edition of the Book of Mormon, there appears in the front pages thereof the testimony of the 8 witnesses who attest to viewing the golden plates from which Joseph Smith claimed to have translated the Book of Mormon. All of these 8 witnesses were either members of the Whitmer family or Joseph's own family. There's Christian Whitmer, Jacob Whitmer, Peter Whitmer Jr., John Whitmer, Hiram Page, who was married to Catherine Whitmer, Joseph Smith's father, Joseph Sr., and his 2 brothers, Hiram and Samuel. Noting the lack of diversity, Mark Twain wrote, "I could not feel more satisfied and at rest had the entire Whitmer family testified." That, in a nutshell, really is the case for Christ. Had Strobel talked to a dozen more Christian apologists, I could not feel more satisfied or at rest. Strobel goes from believer to believer, just accepting exactly what they tell him without investigation or challenge, mostly because he just doesn't have the background to do so. And then we're supposed to be all shocked and awed when this hardcore atheist sees the light. Well, hallelujah. But where is the journalism? He never consults someone who can refute the claims of these Christian apologists. He just assumes that there's no one else on the planet with a contrary opinion. He never takes what these Christian apologists say to someone else with an opposing point of view and says, "Hey, this is what these guys say. What do you say?" Sorry for the intrusion, but I really want to drive this point home. Strobel was a professional journalist for the Chicago Tribune. He had a law degree from Harvard. That's the entire hook of the book and the movie. And still, he couldn't even give us basic he said, she said reporting. For Strobel, it's he said, and I really believe him. I do completely. Strobel sells us his journalism and then pulls a bait and switch, giving us a one-sided polemic without even a little packet of journalism on the side. Maybe that's where this all started. # fake news. If there really is a case to be made, Strobel knows with absolute certainty that this is not how it's done. He has the training. And that really, more than anything else, tells you everything you need to know about our friend Lee. A journalist doesn't have to violate the ethics, standards, and practices of his or her profession to tell a story that's true. Okay, I've said my piece. Carry on, you handsome devil, you. And many of the apologists that he talks to both in the film and the book had sworn a virtual blood oath to the school at which they taught, promising their fidelity to the Christian faith and the inerrancy of the Holy Scriptures. That's what Strobel calls investigative journalism. And it's even more frustrating because the movie itself shows him understanding the concept of biased sources. If you are interested in Strobel's journey, I would recommend reading The Case for Christ, and then immediately after reading Dr. Bob Price's book, The Case Against the Case for Christ. Or actually, you know what? If you want to be a really good journalist like Mr. Strobel, just read Bob's book and be done with it. Lee doesn't need the money anyway. One of the other facts he uncovered during his semi-investigation was that passing the collection plate pays way better than journalism. Unless, of course, you're a Woodward or a Bernstein, right? But Trust me, Lee was never in danger of taking that road.